Hello, Dons fans, and welcome to our Round 16 Don the Stat preview. Bye week has brought some respite from what has been an utterly disappointing year to be a Dons fan. Time to take stock and prepare for a big 9 weeks to finish the season. Whilst finals is out of the picture, there's still a lot to be gained from the back end of the season as we're looking to head into the 2026 off-season with some momentum and hope. We come up against our little siblings for the second time this season, and the chance at revenge for the loss we suffered back in round 3, with a match update on paper, looks very winnable for the Dons. Me and Hume, once again my usual co-host Jono is in transit, making his way back from Europe. He'll be back for next week's preview. So again, after a successful call-up last game, patron Josh Wilson is back helping out the pod, bringing his insights as we preview our clash against North Melbourne. Thanks for joining me again, Josh. How did you spend your bye week?
Thanks, Ian. It was actually great to have some time off the grind of our season, but spent plenty of time watching the Soccer World Cup to fuel my hunger for sport. But I guess back to the harsh reality of our season. So here we go.
Yeah, indeed. It was certainly a pick-me-up to watch the Socceroos the day after that Essendon game, because that Essendon game was a bit of a dirge on the Saturday, and to see the Socceroos do so well was great. Not as good a result against the US, but I think the productivity of Australia tomorrow is going to dip right around midday when they start the Paraguay game. Yeah, so I myself will definitely not be doing very much work during that time, and I imagine most of the people who are listening to this will probably be in the same boat.
Yeah, it's a planned long lunch, mate. 12 o'clock.
Early finish on a Friday, I think. Finish at 11:30 and then just go straight into it. Yeah. Well, look, given the Melbourne game was such a nothing game from Essendon's standpoint and was 2 weeks in the distance, we're not going to spend much of any time on it, because every 3 months a person is torn to pieces by a crocodile in North Queensland. But jokes aside, did you have any big takeaways from the Demons clash, Josh?
Yeah, thanks, Bob. Ian, sorry. Yeah, no, it really was a hard game to watch. Not much excitement for us apart from a 20-minute period in the third. I guess it can feel like a big hill to climb in performance or how the game looked, especially in how we transitioned the footy. But I just wanted to touch on a few reasons why it looked so poor and why it's not all doom and gloom. So during that game, we lost contested possession by 32 and the ground balls by 21. And then that led to the centre clearances we lost by 5. So we got smashed in the contest. So that meant we were just having to defend in our back half a lot because the ball was in dispute. Melbourne just took us to the cleaners. And as they say, old habits die hard, because we completely lost our shape and allowed Melbourne to claim the outside and the corridor side. So it was lose it at the source, then lose the outside. And we've seen it before. So if you look at the third quarter and ask sort of what changed, why did it look so different? Well, after 15 minutes of footy, we had recorded 7-2 inside 50s and 76% time in forward half. So we were winning those contests and getting the ball forward. You can see the flow on in how important contest and shape is, because all of a sudden everything works so much easier and even our ball movement starts to look energised. Then you look at the last 10 minutes of that quarter where Melbourne retook the ascendancy, but something changed. So they had 10 inside 50s in a row and 8 were from midfield chains, but they couldn't kick a goal. So they scored 7 goals, 7 from midfield chains in the first half. So, and that's the game right there. So things did get better. We improved our shape to not allow those easy outside balls and transition. And then with ball in hand, it felt frustrating and slow a lot of the day. And a lot of focus was on the kicking, but you can see what's clearly missing in our game at the moment is that run from behind. So we totaled 52 metres gained by handball to Melbourne's 226. So our season average is 218. So that tells me we just didn't have any run. It was kick or bust. So when Melbourne took our options away, we just got slower. So I just sort of wanted to touch on that, because to me it just shows there's 2 very clear areas to improve and something we can take out of that game.
Yeah, I agree. And I think what you talked about there really highlights the big issues that we've got at the moment. And we've certainly got a lot of issues with the way in which we're playing and the way in which we're executing game plan. But we are so reliant on contests and winning contests. There are teams that can get away with being down in the contest, probably not as much as we were against Melbourne. That was a shellacking, but there are teams that can have other ways of moving the ball and getting that territory if they're not winning contests. You think about, say, the Giants is probably the example in the last couple of seasons where they've been happy to play from the back, and the Orange Tsunami and being able to transition the ball quite well, and they haven't been overly reliant on winning clearance, winning contested ball, they're able to win it back through setup and then transition it going the other way. But we just don't have that. And you mentioned the fact that we have no run. That really is displayed because we don't have that ability to break lines. And one of the ways in which you break teams' zones is through run, and we just don't have that. Like Noah McGrath last week, he's one player who can do it. Sadal Hooley, another one who could do it, but has been in and out at the side. And then other than that, we really don't have a whole lot of line-breaking run on the list. Obviously, we drafted Jackson Artemis, and you would hope that he would come in a couple of weeks and we'd get a sense of whether he could provide some of that. But again, when you take that, we don't have that in the side. As you say, you are reliant on kicking. And then you come up against a Melbourne team which has Max Gawn, who's, as much as he isn't a fantastic ruckman, he's probably also the best down the line defender as well that any team has. So you take away that long kick option because you're kicking to him, and he's going to have an advantage over pretty much anyone that he's competing against. So, it was really obvious why we lost, right? There's not a whole lot to really dig down into that game once you get past those numbers that you brought up, because that was the entirety of the reason that we lost. We couldn't compete in contest, therefore we couldn't get territory. And even when we got the ball back in Melbourne's back half, we had no way of moving the ball back to our end.
Yeah, that's right. And that's sort of, I guess, what I touch on with the doom and gloom. Like, if you're losing games, you want it to be clear there's avenues to improve. And that's sort of what I wanted to touch on, because you can see the clear avenues are there, and it's just about working on it and getting better at it.
Yeah, indeed. And we've had better games at contests this year, so we certainly can do it. It's not like we're getting smashed at contests every week, but I think if you look at the 4 games we've performed worst in the contest this year, they're probably in our 4 worst results of the year. You're thinking the Hawthorn game in round 1, the Bulldogs in round 4, Collingwood in round 7 or 8, whichever one that was, and then the Melbourne game. Probably the only one where we performed okay in contests, but otherwise was pretty poor was the Port Adelaide game in round 2. But yeah, I think it's a pretty clear indicator of when Essendon's having a bad game. If you just look at the contest numbers, it tells you a lot. You can read a lot into what Essendon is doing by those numbers.
It does, yeah. And I think, a part of that is, like, we keep saying that word contest. And so visually you think ball, fight for the ball. But our biggest issue is really what happens outside the contest. So when we don't win that and we're not in the right areas or holding the right shape, we get really burnt. So I guess that's what Solly's spoken about. It's about getting that whole picture right so that you can afford to lose a contest, because you're in the right position and you can pressure and you can strip the ball and get it back. And that's probably our biggest hurdle to climb at the moment.
Yeah, indeed. And I think that will be what we're watching for this coming week. We'll be wanting to see how that contest stacks up against a team that, traditionally that's been one of their better aspects in terms of their play. They've had a lot of weaknesses, North Melbourne, but be able to win the contest has usually been the thing that they've been okay at, or at the very least clearance. As I said, we aren't going to spend a whole lot of time on the Melbourne game, so we'll move on. And we do actually have a Damien Barrett Award nomination this week, and I thought we might get away with no nominations given it was bye week, but the media certainly can't help themselves. Jacob Farah was on the Sunday Footy Show to do the handball competition, and Tony Jones decided to ask him about the coaching situation, which is, I think, fair enough. It's fair enough to ask the question. What probably wasn't fair enough was the further questioning that essentially amounted to badgering an 18-year-old to the point that Rory Sloane had to step in and save Jacob. Jacob's just trying to establish himself as a first-year AFL player, and, he's probably got as lower influence as anyone on who the coach is going to be. I don't think it was really worth, going to the extent that Tony Jones did against an 18-year-old. You're really not going to learn anything from. And Jacob looked quite uncomfortable in it. You could see that the people around Tony Jones looked quite uncomfortable as well. So look there, Chompers, you may have misspec Judd's cheek when trying to kiss her, but you haven't missed out on getting a nomination for the Barrett Award. So you're our round 16 nominee, Tony.
Yeah, we'll just give that a chompity chomp chomp.
Yeah. Well, look, moving on, I think many of us probably expected to have a firm announcement on what the coaching process would look like. I had it down in my running sheet for this episode quite early on. I think it was suggested that the bye week we would get some information, but we are still waiting for official news, which means we're dealing with a lot of secondhand sources and rumours at the moment. The most pervasive one seems to be the idea that Dean Solomon is Andrew Welsh's preferred candidate. And that seems to be one that's getting the momentum, at least in the media, and is certainly being discussed around the media traps. According to Peter Ryan from The Age, it looks like the process will start with some informal meetings with prospective coaches before commencing formal interviews. So we'll probably still be waiting for some further news for a few weeks. I've talked a bit about over the past couple of weeks, both in the Q&A episode and the episode I did with Tommy Wolf, that what I want to see from a coaching process these weeks, but I haven't yet got your take, Josh. What's your current feeling about what we should be looking for in a coach? And does it have to be an Essendon person like some are suggesting?
Look, I can understand the notion or the talk around this. Like it is a unique position that comes with a lot of, I guess you could say, baggage, this role. And as the new coach, you'd need to understand this. But you would think that if at a board and club level, we now really understand what an Essendon person looks like, that would be characteristics that can be clearly defined and found in any person. So including someone that hasn't been associated with, Essendon in the past. So if we're, that we keep hearing that Essendon person, and there's been a lot of talk in the past about the identity of Essendon and being lost. So are we saying now that we really understand what our identity is? And if we can define that, then that doesn't have to be someone that's played for the club or been a part of the club. That's just characteristics that person meets. So that's sort of how I read these sort of things.
Yeah, I agree. And I think the best example of you not needing to be an Essendon person is Kevin Sheedy, right? So obviously he was a Richmond premiership player, but came in and became the most successful coach in the club's history. The longest serving and winning 4 premierships. So it's much about how well you buy in to the team and to the environment and to all the things that comes with it, right? And we talk about baggage and what it means to be an Essendon person. I think it has to be more about than just the on-field coaching and the on-field role. I think there's a whole lot more that goes into it. And I do think the off-field and the way in which the fans react to the coach and engage with the coach is part of it. Because if the coach isn't able to engage with the fans or bring the fans along with it, that's the sort of thing that starts to create pressure on the coach. And ultimately, that's what we saw happen with Brad Scott. He lost a section of the fan base, was unable to bring them along, and that just sort of added and compounded the pressure that was coming from all the other aspects that weren't going right. So the injury crisis and the lack of wins on the board and the turmoil at board level, I guess it all sorts of play a part. So I think as much as I think a lot of people are focusing on what is their coaching ability like and how they're going to run a football program, it's a much bigger role than just that, and they have to take all those aspects into account.
Yeah, definitely. And I guess that's the hurdle. It's when you're not, everyone becomes an Essendon person when you're winning games, but that big picture of when we're not winning and the next coach is in, being able to contain that, and bring everyone along for the ride. So
yeah. I haven't written this down, but do you have a preference between an experienced coach or a first timer? That seems to be the choices a lot of teams are making. I know the history of recent years suggests that you go for the first timer because that's a better chance of winning a premiership. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you should be overlooking the experienced coaches. I include Hurdy as an experienced coach, even though he hasn't coached for a decade. He has got that experience as a senior coach and understands what is required there.
Yeah, I don't really have any preference over how experienced you are or how young you are. It's really looking at it now and saying if we're in a real position where we finally really understand where we are at and what we need, then that's the person you need to find, because it doesn't matter what experience you have or how little experience. Every coach is different. So every coach has a unique, strengths and weaknesses. So it really comes down to that process and really understanding where we're at and what we need, and I guess that, development and things like that, and finding the right person, not the right experience or the right age demographic. It's just we've got to narrow right into the type of person we need.
Yeah, and I think you make a really good point there about Essendon needing to understand exactly where they're at. I think the fact that the performances have been so bad and we are at the bottom of the ladder, it does give a little bit more clarity about where we're at. Because I think when we've gone into coaching changes in the past, I think we've thought we've been underperforming where we should be. Whereas I think at this stage, when we're making this decision, it's pretty clear where we are. We're a bottom 2 side at the moment in terms of performances and in terms of a lot of other metrics like age demographic and experience and things along those lines. So I think that probably gives the people who are going to choose who the coach is going to be a bit more understanding of what sort of person they need to be looking for. You need someone who's going to be able to develop a team for the long term, not someone who you think, if we bring in a really good coach, they're going to get the most out of a team that's been around, between 8 and 10. And that in itself is going to push them up to, say, a top 4 or, a preliminary finalist sort of team. I think where we're at gives us a lot more understanding of exactly what we need, as opposed to previous situations we've gone into this process.
Yeah, it does, definitely. And that's when you look at the work of Dave Barham and, the board making the hard calls. And, not everyone loved Brad, but he was the man for the time and sort of sacrificing himself in a way. He's laid that foundation, and there's no more hiding. There's the clean slate now, and we know where we're at and we know where we need to go. So you got to be thankful for the people before, what's to come for the hard work they did. So,
yeah, indeed. Well, moving on, there's been some more news over the bye period, and as always, trade talk does tend to dominate a lot of the football media. Obviously, it generates a lot of interest, and I can't blame it, because it is interesting to start to speculate what's going to happen. And all through the last week or so, it's been reported quite a lot that both Merrett and Ridley are going to be looking to move on again, whilst Darcy Parish was also brought up as someone who'd be potentially looking to move. As I said, I don't think anyone is all surprised on the first two, given both tried to leave last year and both have had their issues. This year's Zach obviously being moved out of the midfield, Jordan with his body still not being able to get right. I think Parish is a little bit more interesting, and I think there's an obvious suitor for him given his contract, his injury history, and his up and down form. I guess just before we get on to Parish, Josh, where are you at with Merrett and Ridley? I think, are we past the emotional stage of where we're at last year of really trying to hold on to these players, and we're prepared to move them on? And given our lack of experience and the fact that, arguably these are two of our 3 best players on the list, should we still be trying to hold on to them or try to extract maximum value?
Yeah, well, I think, we are past that emotional stage, and you've just got to, you've had time now as a club to assess, and you've just got to position yourself. Player leaves, but what position does that leave us in, and getting the best available? And one of the most, I guess, like the talk that, we had 3 first rounders for Merrett and we should have got rid of him, and then he goes this year, we get less. But the other thing that people don't take into account is this is another year. He was our number 1 midfielder in that midfield of 3 or 4. And this is a whole season we've now been able to develop Roby and Sharp in that midfield. And that means next year you lose a midfielder like Merrett. The damage isn't as bad. And you've got 2 kids that are in their second preseason. They're going to play bulk midfield minutes, and you're going to come out the other end with a first-round draft pick. So, the machinations of that can be argued to death. But, yeah, I think it's just that sort of time at the end of the year. If we're open to the right deals, then we make it happen.
Yeah, I agree. And I think just again, reflecting on last year, we performed poorly in the back end of last year, but there was a really clear reason, right? We had so many injuries and we couldn't perform at the level we thought we could. I think there was reason to believe that if with better injury luck heading into this year, having kept Zach and Jordan, that we could have been performing a lot better than we are. So I think that's another one of the reasons why we didn't want to lose, say, Zach Merrett, because I think if you took out those injuries and you had a full strength squad to pick from, there was an argument that we could have pushed up the ladder this year. Now, I know that obviously hasn't taken place, and injuries have been part of that, but certainly not the whole reason why we've ended up where we're at. But I think you can look at the decision made last year as thinking, well, if we are going to improve, and there was scope for improvement at the end of last year, you're going to want someone like a Zach Merrett around to really help push that. Because if you lose a Zach Merrett, then you end up just treading water and you end up sort of in that 10th spot again. Whereas with a Zach, you could have pushed up for a 6th. So I know that's really pie in the sky and it doesn't sound realistic given where we're at. But I think if you reflect back at the end of last year, we could have seen, with all things going well, that thing happening. Whereas again, like I spoke about with the coach, it's really clear where we're at. We're a fair way off being where we need to be. And as you say, the emotion is now gone. We've gone through the highs and the lows of Zach wanting to leave. And I think there's an element of acceptance on both Zach and Jordan that we can, it's gone across our minds that we're accepting the fact that they could leave. that we can be okay with it.
Yeah, that's it. And sort of like you touched on, like we did, you think back to last year, Melbourne gather round, then, we'd won 4 or 5 games that early part of the year. So we weren't in the phase we are now where we've just seemed to have lost our way a bit in knowing how to win. But there was upside there at the time, wasn't there? So
yeah. And when we were making these decisions around Zach Merrett as well, we had Nick Martin seemingly going through the best ACL recovery you've ever seen, and there was a realistic expectation he'd be back early this year. And if you add Nick, I mentioned that Zach and Jordan are probably 2 of our 3 best players. Well, Nick's the other one in that top 3, and you could have had all, with better injury luck, you could have had all 3 out there, and then suddenly you're a lot more competitive and pushing for those, at the very least, wildcard spots. So, yeah, I think there's a lot more to reflect on when considering that period at the end of last year and the decisions that were made. And obviously, again, the context in which the decisions are going to be made this year is going to be vastly different because of the performance of the side. But I guess just moving on, where do you sit with Parish, Josh? I'm a fan. I know John is a fan. I think we've seen on a couple of occasions this year to the Demons win and then Dreamtime, just how impactful he can be. But I think both of those games were as good as anything he was able to display in that All-Australian year. But he has also had a lot of games where he's a non-factor. He seems to be struggling with the injury aspect or injuries at his body. I guess, is he someone you'd be looking to try and keep around, or would you be happy to let him explore his options?
I think we allow both options to be on the table. There's no doubt that a fully fit Darcy Parish makes us a better football side, but where it sits for us as a club is how our midfield depth looks moving forward. So, are we willing to lose 2 first-picked midfielders from our list? Because, we know we'll get a decent pick for Zach, but I guess you have to look at how this benefits us moving forward. What can we get in return for giving up a senior midfielder that's, going to be first pick when he's healthy? So I guess it just has to be a way to, that both parties are comfortable with the outcome.
Yeah, indeed. And it probably also depends on who else is available out there in the market. I think there was talk the other day that Alex Davies was someone we're looking at from Gold Coast, and another player I think Jono and I have spoken about for the last couple of years as being a really good sort of / quote unquote Moneyball pickup, someone who's got some good upside and can do a job there. There's Sam Marshall from Brisbane, who looks like he's on the outer. So there does seem like there's some midfielders there who, if you did end up losing Merrett and Parish, let's say you picked up Davies, one of Davies or Marshall, you are losing in that. You're not a better side because you've lost Merrett and Parish and brought in Davies. But with the amount of draft picks that you're bringing in over the next couple of years, it's probably not a huge loss there. And I guess I think, looking at the side that they're selecting now, it is hard to get all our midfielders into the side. Maybe you do look to move on from Darcy there.
Yeah, well, and it's obviously that age demographic as well. It's the same for Merrett. Is if he's questioning whether he's going to be around for the next successful tilt. Well, is there any point holding on to someone like that? And like you say, bring in someone that's closer to that. Maybe not as high quality, but is closer to that age demographic that can be part of the depth and grow with the group.
Yeah, indeed. And then at the other end, we've been connected to a couple of players who we could be looking to bring into the club. And the one that does keep coming up quite a lot is Gold Coast Jed Walter. I guess, where do you see our approach to him? There's obviously talent there, but I've been a little underwhelmed with what I've seen so far. He doesn't actually exactly scream star key forward at this stage, and Gold Coast are certainly going to want a lot to part with him. I guess if we do finish last, it will be the time to play the walk into the preseason draft card, which is one of the advantages you get finishing at the back end of the draft. But I think we've talked on the show before about opportunity costs. So if you're spending so much on a certain player, you're missing out on other opportunities. And is the amount that you're spending on that player worth it over the alternative? So I guess you're thinking that Walter and May would probably be competing for the same spot. I guess that depends on what happens with Peter Wright going forward. But is the extra money and picks you'd have to spend on getting Jed Walter, is that going to be an improvement on what you get on Archie May from what we've seen so far on the relative contract value?
Yeah, that's it. And that's the landscape on that's probably changed a lot. So the early days, it might have been a pretty smart play by the club, seeing an early pick key forward not getting a game in front of Ben King and potentially one of our own players wanting to go to Queensland, the idea of maybe being able to get something done there, at a good value, because at the end of the day, if you're bringing in another key position prospect that has upside, and has done the 2 or 3 preseasons, to me, it's, we can look at the output and positional, but we've got so many question marks at the moment over a lot of the key positional stocks on our list. So, to bring in another one that, I guess if you look at where it sits now, so Gold Coast have offered now $5 million over 5 years. So they've offered him $1 million a season. So, and our offer was $4 million over 5 years. So it was $800K per season. So, and there was reports that the Magpies were prepared to offer up to 1.1. So obviously what's happened now in that market as well is the game's changed, because Ben King isn't signing for the Gold Coast, and that's what's caused them to throw that offer. So I guess if you look at it overall now, what we would probably have to do to get him in the doors, it's probably starting to look a bit like you sort of say, it's a little bit overwhelmed now with what we'd have to pay and the picks and that sort of thing. But yeah, I've actually enjoyed the concept of us as a club and what we're doing behind closed doors, and these looking for these smart opportunities to be able to make the list better. It's not something I'm going to complain about, and as much as I could think, positionally that's not a need, but if you see the avenue, it's worth having a go. So
yeah, exactly. And I think there's clearly upside to Jed. I do wonder whether he'd pair well with a Nate Caddy. I think that would be the question mark, because obviously, you said there's question marks over a lot of our key forward stocks. Well, one player there isn't a question mark over is Nate Caddy. I think he's progressing is exactly how we would expect. And so you're starting to look, you have to start thinking about the pieces as how do they pair with Nate Caddy, right? Like you can't just, there's a world where you bring in a player like a Jed Walter and he's competing with Caddy in that sense that he doesn't complement him. So I guess it's a question there. And then the other interesting bit of information was that we were said to be into Lachie Neale, and we were sounding him out before the news of Brad Scott's sacking. I think he's exactly the sort of player you'd want to help, or you'd want to bring into your club to teach the players what required on the best. It does sound like now that since Brad's been let go, we're not going to get him. And it almost sounds like it's a done deal for him to go to the Collingwood Retirement Village. I mean, the Collingwood Football Club. But I like that the club is actively exploring these options, especially, as we've talked about just before, with the likely exit of some of our senior players. I guess if Lachie Neale is no longer an option, is there anyone of a similar ilk that you want us to bring in, Josh?
Yeah, like not sure there'd be many better options out there than Lachie Neale to match our current needs. Putting him like in and around our young midfield core of Roby, Sharp and Does would be a dream, really. But another area of the ground is defence as well. Like we've got a lot of younger players in that area, and a player like Ryan Lester. So he's 33. He's at Brisbane, and he's probably having a career best year just about. He's injured at the moment, but he gets 1 year deals year after year. So maybe someone like that, like offer him 2. And he's a player you could lock in to play that third tall. So and pass on all his knowledge to the likes of Reid, Roberts, Farrow, Condigianis. That's somewhere I think we could gain real value. And especially if Ridley leaves, someone to play that third tall, it's sort of a win-win.
Yeah, he's a name that's come up a lot when we've sort of talked about this question. I think you're right. And I think, as much as he's been really loyal to Brisbane, he's probably at the stage where, paying him an excessive amount, and you probably have to pay him an excessive amount to come down to Essendon for a couple of years. But we can afford to do that because of our salary cap space. You've got to pay someone. So you might as well pay someone to almost act as an on-field coach at the same time. So yeah, I like that option. Whether he would be interested or whether we would approach him is another matter. But again, you're right. It's the sort of move we should be making at this stage of our development. Well, look, I asked you to think about what you wanted to see from Essendon post-bye. So look, I'll start with my first one. I'll get your thoughts and then I'll get your first one there. So for me, the first thing I want to see post-bye is to get Jacob Farrow some looks in the midfield, whether that is at the very least on a wing or even some centre bounce time, because I think we want to get him kicking into 50 as much as we can. Obviously, it's really important to have those good kicks leaving defensive 50, but I think he's someone who can really improve our forward entries, and getting him up the ground in the midfield is a way to do that. And as a sort of a cheeky aside one, I'd love to see at least one centre bounce this year with all of Sharp, Roby and Farrow in those centre bounce midfielders there.
Yeah, that'd be awesome, wouldn't it? I'll take a different approach and look at this from a game style and a statistical point of view. So I'll quote Solly here. So this was from today. We want to drive a bit more ball forward, a bit more time in forward half over time in possession team. So what does that look like? So my first thing would be, moving the ball forward means you need to win the ball. So I want to use differentials here so I can see week to week there is direct improvement stacked against our opposition. So the first one would be, contested possession. So we're currently ranked 14th at minus 4.1 per game. So that's my first marker to follow.
Yeah, you'd want to see some improvement in that. And you're right, Solomon has really spoken about the contest as being the basis of what he's trying to impart there. My second one, and this is going to be something that's going to come up in a couple of weeks, and he may start in the VFL, but how are we going to reintegrate Peter Wright back into this side? Because, what we saw from the first half of the year before he got injured, he was playing at a really high level as a ruckman who was then able to go forward and have an impact there. But since he's been out, we've seen Brian doing pretty well as a ruckman. We've seen Ben Mackay go forward and again perform pretty well as a key forward. So I guess I'm really interested to see what they do with Peter Wright when he comes back. Does Mackay go back and Blackinson go out? Do you try and find a way to play Mackay still forward whilst also having Peter Wright there? Yeah, I'm really interested to see what they do there. I don't really have an answer at this stage. And I guess also the thing to consider is that Brian has been playing as a number one ruck, but Wright's best form was also playing as sort of that 60-70% ruck time. So how do you balance that? So yeah, I think it's a really interesting watch for how they play that as the season progresses.
Yeah, you're right. Actually, that's a really good one because I guess we've got a 9 to 10 week runway, and these are the sort of things you'll with your personnel. You want to be sorting that out now. This is your chance to experiment and to do these things and actually figure these ones out. Like for how we're going to look moving forward. So my sort of second thing is a pretty simple one as well, but it's the uncontested possession differential. So we're currently ranked 16th. So we're conceding to our opponent 25.7 more uncontested possessions per game. So we're allowing sides to have the outside and use the ball a lot easier than they allow us.
Yeah, indeed. And I think that comes from two aspects. It comes from what you spoke about before, the contested possession, right? If you're winning contested possession, you can get it to the outside and get those uncontested possessions. But the differential is blowing out so much is because once teams are getting it on the outside, we can't get it back off them. We can't force them to kick to a contest. Too often there's an easy outlet kick or an outlet handball for our opposition to sort of move the ball, and that breaks open our defensive structure. So yeah, I think if we fix number one of your points, number two resolves itself a little bit, but you've still got that other aspect you've got to try and fix as well.
Yeah, well, that's it. And that, this is all revolving around the game style of wanting to be a forward half team. So you can't allow, you can, if you want to be forward half, the game's got to be a lot more contested because you're going to be squeezing the ground. So allowing your opposition to keep doing and moving the footy is like they are a lot more than we're allowed to. That's going to not allow us to be a forward half team.
Yeah, indeed. Moving on to my number 3, and we might actually see this week because of the extended bench, but I want to see Kako and Alashka playing in the same side. I'm tearing my hair out so often seeing us run with one small forward, the land of the Giants down in our forward line. It drives me nuts. So hopefully we're able to see both of those players, or at least a combination of at least 2 small forwards running around in the senior side for the rest of the year and then into the future, because I think that's where the AFL is, right? It's about the smalls are arguably more important than the talls.
Definitely. And I'm with you, mate. I've been ripping what hair I have left out that for a long time, so that'd be great to see. My third one would be, we can look at it as the inside 50s. So we're currently ranked 17th in the competition at minus 8.8 per game. So that's, week to week, minus 8.8 against our opposition. So again, we want to be I'm looking for changes in this second half of the year. If we want to be a forward half team, we need to repeat entries and stopping that ball going down the other end. And so I want to see that improve.
Yeah, absolutely. On to my number 4, and I want to, again, similar to my previous one, but I want to find ways to get more run into the side. So I think, judging on what Solomon said in his press conference today, we can expect Artemis to come in at some stage. But if you could find a way to get him and Al Julian together, for example, it could give us something we've lacked for quite some time. We weren't a perfect side when we had McKenna and Sard playing from half back, but it did give us a lot of impetus from that back half and gave us a weapon. We had Nick Hine for a little bit, doing it on his own. But we haven't, for 6 or 7 years, we really haven't had dual threats of run from the back half that can really break those zones down.
Yeah, definitely. And I guess that's part of the new rules and the way the game is now. You really need that. I'll have a look. So the next one, number 4. So then if we're talking about driving the ball forward more, so can I see a clear improvement on our metres gained metric where we currently average minus 513.6 per game than our opposition? So yeah, ultimately, you look at the Melbourne game, they were almost 1,000 more metres gained with their disposal of the footy than we were. So that match, and you can visually see that too, the way we're moving the ball compared to how they're moving the ball. So that has to be a metric that changes.
Yeah, absolutely. My last thing I want to see from Essendon post-bye is that, there's certainly an argument to try and lose every game, or not try and lose, but to lose every game from here to guarantee that pick one and pick the best non-aligned kid in the draft, because it is something that we've needed for quite some time, that top-end talent. But I think I need to see at least one win in this back half of the year. I just think, for the sake of everyone, connected to the club, the staff, the players, and the fans, of course, I think we all need to experience that winning feeling at least one more time this year. Especially since the only win we've had was over in Adelaide. Now, I was lucky enough to actually be there, so it's a little bit different for me because I've actually been to an Essendon win in the last 12 months. But for so many fans, they haven't been able to experience that. And I think just for the sake of everyone's sanity, we need to find a way to win one game. And if that means that we end up with, we finish 17th instead of 18th, so be it.
Yeah, and that's fair, and that's footy. We're there to win. So, I mean, the draft is what it is. So, to get that winning feeling in the group again as well, and for supporters and everyone. So definitely. So my number 5. So the end result is ultimately measurable as time in forward half. So we currently sit 17th at 46.9% time in forward half in games on average. So the top 4 on the ladder sit in the top 4 for this metric. So, Sydney, Geelong, Fremantle and Hawthorn are in the top 4 for time in forward half, over 52%, around 51, 52%. So, you're talking in percentages. It sounds like not a big number, but it represents such a big value in the game and how the game looks. So getting all these metrics right in, the contest, outside the contest, locking the ball in, those sort of things. And we've screamed for, people scream for, under Scott now, what is our brand? What does it look like? What is it? And, we've got a coach here that's telling us what the brand wants to be. So, that's sort of what I want to hang my hat on for the rest of the year and looking at these metrics to say, all right, is this actually evolving? Is this improving? So,
yeah, you're right. And I think one of the things that stands out about the points that you've made there in your 5 things, they're all connected, right? Like, they're all interrelated. And so if you improve one of them, you should start seeing improvements in some of the others. So yeah, it's going to be an interesting watch for the rest of the year. And when we get to the end of the season, I'm sure John and I will do a deep dive into what things look like under Scott and what things look like under Solomon, both, in terms of the visuals and in terms of the numbers. And I think they'll be really interesting to sort of see what's changed or what's stayed the same. Let's move on to examining our opponents this week, the Kangaroos. And the Kangaroos have played 11 games since Essendon faced them earlier in the year. In that time, they've won 5 and lost 6. They're currently sitting in 10th spot with 7 wins, 7 losses, and a percentage of 90.7. So their wins since playing against us are Richmond twice, Carlton, Gold Coast, and the Eagles. So all their wins are teams, other than the Gold Coast, have come against teams that sit below them on the ladder, and Gold Coast are sort of in a bit of a funk at the moment. So, I think their ladder position is probably a fair indication of where they're at. They're better than the teams below them, and they struggle against the teams above them. Unfortunately for us, we're below them, so they would be going in expecting another win for them. I think one of the things that stands out looking at North, and we're not going to do a full deep dive of the numbers because we did that at the start of the season. Is there a team that wants to generate a lot of ruck contests? So they average 93 a game, which is the third best in the competition. So this has led them to be the top scoring side from ball-ups this year. They average 17.7 points, but they also get scored against the other way, being the second worst defensively, giving up 14.4 a game. So it is interesting that they're a team that wants to generate ruck contests, and that's really different to us. We're a team that really doesn't generate a whole lot of a ruck contests. And it's going to be interesting with them to see how they cope with Sherry last week, both in terms of winning clearance and in scoring from them. So Sherry leads the Roos players for score launches with 4 per game. A lot of that score launches will be down to his ruck work, particularly around the ground where he's been most effective. I guess what's been your impression of North so far this year, Josh? They've probably improved in a few areas on previous seasons. They've also had a really soft draw, and that's even with their self-imposed handicap of selling 2 games to Western Australia. So, as I said before, I think that the ladder position is a fair indication of where they're at and the teams that they're better than. But they certainly aren't. They're probably at the most, a small chance for a wildcard final at this stage. So they're ahead of us based on this season, but certainly not to the point where we should feel that like this game is beyond our reach in terms of winning it.
It definitely shouldn't. I think they've definitely had a lift in output from their youth. So, Sheasel's gone up a notch again. Then you got the likes of Finn O'Sullivan, McKercher, Trenbath. So they're all that 20 to 21-year-old, age group that have now sort of lifted their level, their base level, and got a lot more consistent. And, that's sort of allowed their older players to find more consistency, from week to week. But ultimately, if you look at that back line and that back half of the ground, they're still very vulnerable when the mid group gets beaten. And, that's potentially, the way they play is trying to play to that strength of that younger core and where their talent is in the midfield and making it hard to get it, to not expose that back half.
Yeah, indeed. And I think, again, that's where you get North right. You get those repeat entries into the forward line and you sort of break down their defence. It's not a very strong defence on paper or in practice there. Moving on then to selection, and Essendon with the Sunday game has added 6 players to their list with 3 to go out on Friday. In some big injury, Captain Andy McGrath returns along with Jai Caldwell, Darcy Parish and Isaac Kako, with Sato Hooley and Tom Edwards also included on the extended bench. Out goes Roberts and Langford with their injuries. It was pleasing to see that it looks like Archie Roberts will get back this year. There was talk that it could have been a season-ending shoulder injury, but it does seem to have come up well, and we might see him again in only a couple of weeks, which I think for his season is really good because he's obviously had such a strong year. And then Elijah Sardis is the only player omitted there. It is kind of tough on Elijah with Parish and Caldwell coming back, that they're automatic selections to that midfield. So someone unfortunately does have to get pushed out. Setterfield probably played his best game for the club against Melbourne. So unfortunately for Elijah, he was the one that got forced out. But I also think that with the sort of section, patch of play that we've seen from Elijah over the last few games, I think we're probably in the same position in terms of knowing what Elijah is as we were when he came back into the team. His strengths are still his strengths and his weaknesses are still his weaknesses. It doesn't seem to have changed much over the course of the last couple of years. He's still really good at extracting the ball. I think his disposal is probably slightly improved to what it was a couple of years ago, but the defensive efforts still aren't there. And when you're a young team like us, you need everyone to pull their weight defensively. Otherwise, you get found out. I think there's a lot open in terms of selection here. I know I would pick Blackiston as a Trenbath matchup, which I'll explain on later, but there is a world where with Sherry out, the Bombers think they can manage with just Reid and Ridley as key defenders and use more run from halfback with Al-Hooley in the side. I'd also personally like to see Edwards come in for Jones, considering their respective form lines, but Jones is named on the ground. That's not guaranteed that he'll be in, but it's usually an indication that they are going to play if they're named on the ground. The extra midfield will probably also be useful to give Sullivan Roby a bit of a chop out. He's been carrying a huge load as a first-year player, and instead of having to admit him to give him a rest, they can sort of play more forward this week to give him a break. As I mentioned earlier, in the things I want to see post-bye, fingers crossed that both Kako and Alashka end up in the final side somehow. Your thoughts on the extended selections, Josh?
Yeah, great inclusions. I'd really love to see McGrath and Al-Hooley slot into that back line. That drive and run that we really lacked last week gets sorted pretty quick with them too. then, as you mentioned, the Kako-Lachie duo screams excitement. We need to see that. But overall, yeah, it's nice to see players off the injury list and back out there. So, even to help with the VFL. And it's just a good feeling knowing the season, we're late into the season, or we're halfway through, even into the colds of winter, but we're actually starting to go the opposite way as we had in the past. So we've got numbers and players ready to go.
Yeah, it is nice to see that injury list come down. And I think the VFL has been performing pretty well, even with the injuries. And again, it's been really mentioned strongly that the VFL is so important for the development of the young players, and that you need to be competitive there. And I think that's what we've done this year, other than a couple of times. I guess just before we move on to North Melbourne, where are you at with Elijah Sardis? Do you think there's still hope for him at Essendon, or do you think the fact that he's been dropped now, given the position that we're in this season, does that spell the end for him?
Yeah, it's really, it's a hard one. It just seems to be that, that change in, I guess the biggest trouble is that transition side of the game, and, not just defensive, but being able to transition. And, at VFL, that step up to AFL, just like you said, that still just seems to be the same issue. So, it's just one of those things. I guess it's a call for him to make, and the club as well, with the midfield depth coming through, whether it's time to for him to look elsewhere, scenario.
Yeah. Well, look, just onto North Melbourne. They've got 4 ins with their extended bench with Hardiman, Dawson, Coleman Jones and Goda named, with the only Sherry being the confirmed out at the moment. And all those ins are named on the extended bench. Riley Hardiman, he's actually my neighbour. I'll try and keep away from him for the next a couple of days, so I don't feel the urge to do something. I would never do that, but yeah. He was good. He was good for them last year off halfback, but it's been injury interrupted this season. So I think there's potentially he comes back in if they feel he's ready to go. But yeah, it's up in the air there. You would think, on paper it would be a straight swap of Sherry for Coleman Jones, but perhaps they'll look to go smaller and rely on Trembath, Goad and Darling to carry the ruck. But that said, given Trembath's form as a forward, if you were North, you'd probably want him down the forward line as much as possible. So they might just go with the Coleman Jones to sort of be that sacrificial lamb in the ruck to allow them to have Trembath forward a bit more. Moving on then to North's last game. They played the Tigers at the MCG and ran out 25-point winners 73-48. It was a pretty tight and boring game for the opening half, but a late goal to the Kangaroos saw them take an 8-point lead to the main break, and it was really that third quarter where they broke the game open with the 3-0 turn. And they did enough in the last quarter to run out 25-point winners. The Tigers threatened at occasions, but every time they did, North found a settling goal and then sort of kept them at arm's length. It was really a game where the Roos controlled the ball on the outside. They took 44 marks for the game, more marks for the game, including 8 more inside 50. And that also contributed to the fact they were much more efficient when going inside 50. They're scoring on for 54% of their forward 50 entries, whereas they restricted the Tigers to scores on only 40%. So their defence really well held up on the Tigers' entries there. Caleb Daniel really controlled the game for the Kangaroos, and it was one of the reasons why they took so many more marks. He had 40 disposals and 16 marks, whilst Harry Sheezel with 31 and Luke Parker with 30 also had a lot of the ball. Cooper Trembath was the main threat up forward. He had 4 goals, whilst George Wardlaw was the only other multiple goal kicker with 2. Any thoughts on this game, Josh?
Yeah, it really was, sort of controlled by that back half with Daniel and Luke Parker. So, being able to run up from behind all day, basically, and just, handball receives and use the footy and try and cut through Richmond. So, I guess that's something, you allow them space in the back half and they have that experience there, and that's how they try to use them. So, and it obviously worked well for them on the weekend.
Yeah. Well, look, moving on to the match itself and some of the things we'll look into in the match. And I think one interesting thing watching the Kangaroos the past couple of weeks is they've really moved away from Tristan Sherry being their prime centre bounce ruckman. And I think with the new ruck rules in place that favour leaping ruckman, they've been using Cooper Trembath and Taylor Goad in there more. So, they've gone at -2 centre bounces these last couple of weeks when Trembath and Goad have done most of the centre bounce ruck work. That's actually an improvement from the previous 2 weeks when Jerry was doing most of the ruck work and they were going at -6 centre bounce clearances. So whilst, it's helped them to equalise at centre bounce a lot more using those leaping ruckmen. So I do wonder if this is a week for Blackerson to step up as a ruckman, given his leap is bigger than Brian's. And, I think that there's a world where he could perhaps follow Cooper Trembath wherever he goes and act as both defender and ruckman, and then leave Brian for more of that around the ground work. And I think going into this week, before we knew about Tristan Xerri, it was going to be a big struggle to deal with that ruck work around the ground because he's so good at it, both in terms of being a tap ruckman, but also in terms of winning those clearances himself. So to have him out, it's going to be a big loss for them. And it's a really opportunity there for Brian to step up and be effective. But it's also not going to be as big an impact for the Roos at centre bounce as we may have thought a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah, and that's not a bad call with Blackiston to Trembath. I guess Cooper Trembath, he's sort of, he's come out of the woodwork and he's shown he's a very capable forward as well. So, if you can sort of look, that spring he has, and you can look to take that bite out of his game, and that'll also put a lot of pressure on Lachie up forward. Trembath kicked 4 goals last week, and playing as that second tall really deloads Lachie's game. So, it's actually not a bad idea, really, is it?
Yeah, well, we'll get a sense of whether that's an option when we get the final teams tomorrow. I think you spoke about it a little bit earlier, but clearances is going to be a big watch for us. So we're so reliant on them from territory, given we struggle to move the ball from the back half. So hopefully the return of Parish and Caldwell will assist us in this. Caldwell hasn't had a great year, but hopefully he can kickstart and have a strong back end to the year. And we know how good Darcy Parish is at winning clearances. Because even without Tristan Xerri, the Kangaroos had 3 other players in the top 50 for average clearances per game this year, and in Luke Davies-Uniacke, Harry Sheasel, and George Wardlaw. Whereas for us, only Darcy Parish has made it into the top 50. So, I imagine that a lot of those 3 midfielders for North's clearance work is down to having Tristan Xerri as a ruckman, so that losing him may impact their effectiveness as well. But I guess of those 3 midfielders, who's the biggest one you think we need to focus on? And is there someone from our side you think is best equipped to handle that challenge?
I'd have to say, and you got to look at recent form, and I have to say Harry Sheasel is probably the one you have to be worried about the most. So he had the most clearances for North last week, but he actually attended 6 less centre bounces than the other 2. So, that stoppage work around the ground as well. And he was equal first for score involvements with 7. That's for the whole game. So, yeah, with Caldwell potentially back in the side, I'd sort of love him to get the job. We've sort of talked about him looking a bit banged up and maybe a bit out of form. Yeah, just I'd love him to see him get that job. I always remember an Anzac Day where he was on Dacos and he gave him the gut punch, and that's the Caldwell we love. That's that Essendon edge. I'd love to see him get that job and just get down and dirty with him and get in his face. Bring back some of the the Essendon spirit. Eh?
Yeah, indeed. I think that's the sort of thing that can get a player back into form, right? You give him a really simple task. You're on Harry Sheasel today. It's your job to try and nullify him, and you get that sort of player a little win, and that can sort of kickstart their year, right? Because they get some confidence from that, and that can flow into other aspects of their game. I think the other thing to watch for with North is how well they do when they're able to control the game with ball in hand. So in their wins this year, they're averaging 112 marks, but only 85 in their losses. So it's not something we've been really good at this year, taking away opposition's uncontested marks, but it's going to be really important in this game if we are going to win that we try and take that away from them. So part of that is controlling the ball ourselves, but the other part is being able to stop them when they have the ball. And I think this is where our half forwards are going to have a really big role. If we can take away the easy mark from them in the back half, that's going to really challenge their ball movement and give us a lot of opportunities to win the ball back. I think it's really important for us to make the ground small on them, really press up on them. If we pull back and give them that space, I think they'll just sort of pick their way around us. But if we're able to get that pressure up on the ball carrier and really hurry sort of that first kick out of defensive 50, I think that's when we can really, really challenge North. And you do run if you are pressing up like that, you do run the risk of being found out over the back. But I think it's worth it if you can challenge that easy ball movement that they like.
Yeah, definitely. And like you look at the numbers from last week, Daniel, Parker, and Sheasel. I mean, that's their 3 best kickers. So allowing them to have 40, 30, and 30 it's going to set them up. So it's exactly what you say. You just look at how it unfolded last week, and you just take that away from them. Squash them in and close them up, and don't let them chip the ball around and use their skill.
Yeah, I guess thinking the other way, put yourself in Alistair Clarkson's shoes for me, and look, as you try not to punch a wall, what do you think he would be most concerned with when it comes to Essendon?
Well, if you looking at the incoming selections, I guess, and then you add the return of Sharp last week, we have a stacked midfield now, so that would have to be the strongest personnel we've fielded all year. So you'd think their focus would be on containing our midfield group. Very similar, trying to, I guess, the strength of our game looks like that area. So, that's where it's won or lost.
Yeah. I think it'll be interesting to see whether they feel the need to tag any of our players. I think even in games we've won in the past, their midfield has done quite well. I think Luke Davies-Uniacke has typically done quite well against us in the past. So, I think there's a potential where they'll feel they can just go head-to-head and back themselves to win it. But again, with no Tristan Sherry this week, and he's been so important to them in terms of their contested work, it'll be interesting to see whether they switch and try and negate us a bit more, given that we're likely to have a ruck advantage this week.
Yeah, that will be interesting. But I guess, I don't know, it's a tricky mentality because, going by ladder positions and things that have unfolded, it's almost they're the hunted, in our mindset. And, Solomon's shown that he's the one that, he set a field on Cripps and those sort of things. So, yeah, it'd be an interesting little battle on the weekend.
Yeah, it's not been too often in the past decade now that North have gone into an Essendon game as the favourite. I think they went in early this year as the favourite, but it's not a position they're used to being in against Essendon. So it'll be interesting to see how they handle it. And look, that sort of takes us on to my final thoughts. And this is not usually a place for match predictions as a final thought, but I will hear Josh. So I guess, how confident are you that this will be our first win in Melbourne for over a year?
I'd say I'd have to be 50% confidence, mate. You can't have any confidence really, like what you're going to get. But you look at the ins and things like that, and yeah, this has got to be one of our best chances for the year to take it right up to them.
Yeah, indeed. I think if you look ahead, there's not too many games on paper you would think that we're a huge chance in. And I think this is one of the best opportunities. And coming off a bye, giving our players a chance to freshen up, I think this is as good as any. And I think they'll be really keen to come out strong this week. And hopefully they are able to get that win there. Look, thanks so much for joining me this evening, Josh. I really appreciate you stepping up to the show these past couple of weeks. I know the listeners have enjoyed your take on things, as they made mention at the Founders Bar before the Melbourne game. You've got quite a lot of compliments for your work in that game, and I'm sure the same will happen this week. I know Jono's going to be back next week for a preview, but I'm sure I'll definitely be looking to have you back on again sometime this year. Maybe it's a special bonus episode post-season. Any final words from you?
No, thanks again, mate. Yeah, getting more comfortable on the podcast recording. So, like I said, mate, I love me footy and love me Bombers, and just appreciate it, mate. And yeah, it's something I sort of really enjoyed doing. So, appreciate the opportunity, and hopefully Jono doesn't have too much of a tan when he gets back, right, to the cold Melbourne winter. But yeah, thank you.
Cheers, mate. Again, really appreciate all your efforts. Well then, listeners, this is it for the show. See you all on Sunday, and until then, stay safe. Go Dons.